The Appellate Division, First Department is now in session. The next case on for argument is Northern Manhattan versus City of New York, whenever counsel is ready.
Good afternoon, and may it please the court. My name is Scott Shore, and I represent the City of New York. This court should reverse Supreme Court's order and reinstate the City Council's resolutions. Supreme Court applied the wrong standards to the city's environmental review. Number one, it ignored the rule of reason. And that is the rule familiar to this court, that subject to review for rationality, agencies have discretion to select the environmental impacts that are most relevant to their determinations. The rule also affords agencies room to exercise their discretion about which impacts to analyze, how to analyze them, how deeply to analyze them, and how to make numerous line drawing decisions. The trial court had a totally different conception of environmental review, where it's some sort of open forum where members of the community can come and force the city to undertake additional substantive review for every issue raised. But we have precedent cited in our brief that an environmental impact statement doesn't need to scrutinize every environmental problem brought to the agency's attention or address every...
Sure, this is Justice Richter. Could you address the fact that the city's analysis does not break any of this information down to explore the impact on racial and ethnic groups, an issue that certainly is of concern to some of the amici here?
I realize it is an issue of substantial concern, Your Honor, and that really goes to the question of residential displacement. And here, the FICE projection, which is not challenged by the petitioners here, the FICE projection is that the rezoning here will not result in a significant adverse residential displacement of low-income residents. And there are a couple of reasons for that. And that is that the rezoning is going to add housing, including permanently affordable housing, as the demand for housing in Inwood continues to rise. We're looking at about over 4,000 new housing units, about a quarter of which will be permanently affordable. And once the determination was made that there was not going to be an adverse displacement effect for residential use, it didn't make particular sense to demand that the city go further and do a racial impact analysis.
Wasn't there some reference somewhere? I'm sorry. Wasn't there some reference somewhere? I don't know. It may have been in a prior case that even though a lot of additional housing would be added and was added as a result of the rezoning, that it didn't necessarily not this result in adverse displacement, so that what is being said is not necessarily what happens. And since there was some testimony about that, should there have been further review of that issue?
I think Your Honor may be referring to the argument that the FICE here should have analyzed what happened in previous rezonings from 20 years
Correct.
Ago in different neighborhoods. Those rezonings were designed to reach a completely different goal. It was to create a new central business district. And here, the goal is additional affordable housing. It's really apples and oranges. The petitioners have not made any showing that it was irrational for the city not to make the advocacy points that they made to City Council about the quality of the environmental review. I did want to go back to the racial impact analysis and note what happened in Jackson. In Jackson, there was an argument made very similar to the one here, that isn't enough to analyze displacement of residences in the neighborhood. The lead agency had to go further and do an analysis of the impact, the specific impact on elderly residents of the neighborhood. And even though the projection in case was that there would be a substantial displacement effect on moderate and low-income residents, the New York Court of Appeals nevertheless held, no, you do not need to do the subgroup analysis. And that was affirming this court's decision, where this court said that there's no obligation to try to analyze the specific and idiosyncratic effects on particular subgroups. Justice Richter, that is the answer to many of the questions about racial impact analysis, including with respect to the commercial decision. The FICE found that there would not be a substantial adverse impact on commercial entities. And that, again, not challenged by petitioners here. There are many reasons for it, including the addition of new people to the neighborhood, which is expected to increase.
Right, but I think you know, it's the follow-up question, that there also is a concern that you haven't addressed, or the plan, not you, the plan did not address the subset of minority and women-owned businesses. So I'm just wondering why the manual doesn't provide that these issues, which I think the city might agree are critical, aren't part of the planning analysis.
Well, the manual. This court held recently in PS 163 that compliance with the manual is a strong indicator of rationality. I will note that the SECRA manual undergoes periodic revision. We don't know what the next version is going to say, but we do know that the current version does not require that kind of analysis. And again, under Jackson, it wasn't required. Again, here, we don't have a finding that there will be a potential adverse impact on commercial uses. And therefore, it wasn't irrational not to go and do the further subgroup analysis that commenters would have liked. And similar with respect to the library, it was rational for the city to rely on representations made by the New York Public Library about how they were going to provide
Mr. Shore,
library services.
Question, but there's a procedural issue that that has been raised in this case regarding the city council's vote prior to the lead agency's findings. Could you address that, please, in the remaining time?
Yes, I'd be happy to, Your Honor. There is only, well, first of all, the timing was absolutely consistent with SECRA. There is one main timing rule in SECRA, and that is that an involved agency, has to wait at least 10 days after the FICE is published before it takes its action. And that is what City Council did here. The trial court, in addition to overlooking any analysis of the rationality of the city's decisions with respect to the FICE, also was wrong and invented a new rule about the order in which the lead agency and City Council have to make their actions and articulate their statement of findings. The statement of findings made 2 months after City Council acted, the one by the lead agency, there was nothing substantive there that City Council needed to analyze. It was a statement as required by SECRA that the agency had read the FICE, had considered the environmental impacts, and had decided on balance that the project was worth pursuing.
But you're saying, Mr. Shore, that there is no requirement anywhere that that statement of findings by the lead agency had to come out at some time prior to when the city council acted, as long as the city council waited for 10 days after the FICE came out. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, Your Honor. The only trigger in SECRA is that the FICE be published 10 days before the involved agency act. There's another rule that says the involved agency has to issue a statement of findings before or when it takes its action, and that was complied with here as well. We would ask this
Let me see if any, I think we have your answer. Your time is up. Let me see. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, you do have rebuttal time. Let's hear from Respondents' Counsel.
Thank you, Your Honors. Michael Sussman appearing for the responding. First, I want to address the procedural infirmity which you just ended with. Counsel's analysis is inaccurate. Undeniably here, the Deputy Mayor's Office of Housing and Economic Development was lead agency for the SECRA review. Publishing notice of that FICE is not, as the city maintains in its reply brief at page 23, the end of its environmental review. As lead agency under New York Code Rule and Regulation 617.11a, its adoption of a finding statement represents, quote, the lead agency's decision on an action that has been the subject of a final EIS. And 617.11c confirms this. No involved agency may make a final decision to undertake an action until the lead agency has made a written finding statement. The second agency referred to in C is the lead agency, if you read the text, not the, quote, involved agency. Accordingly, City Council, which did not conduct the review, was not the lead agency, had to await the lead agency to adopt the finding statement before passing the rezoning. Under A, the written finding statement represents the lead agency's decision on the action. It contravenes the cited state regulation to argue, as does the city, that an agency other than the lead agency can approve the action before the lead agency has made the finding statement. Now, the most critical issue before your honors here, and you started with this, Judge Richter, and congratulations, by the way, on your service, and congratulations on what was said by Judge Kapnick. The most critical issue here is very clear. We talk about institutional racism until we're all blue in the face. But what we have here, and what Judge Saunders was clear about, she was not making up any rule. She was not making up a rule at all. She was following Chinese staff, which is a seminal 1986 Court of Appeals.
Mr. Sussman, this is Justice Richter. Given the standards as set by the Court of Appeals and the prior precedents of this court, you're asking us to affirm a decision ordering the city to keep data and do an analysis that the manual does not require. How about the recent cases? How do you reconcile those with the argument you're making?
Well, the most recent case is Matter of Churches, and you're dealing in that situation with a single project. You're not dealing with the rezoning of an entire part of the city. The teaching in your cases, including the 163, PS 163 case, is very clear. This is what the court said. An agency's compliance with the substantive secret obligations is governed by a rule of reason, and the extent to which particular environmental factors ought to be considered varies in accordance with the circumstances and nature of particular proposals. That's what the court said there. That's the majority opinion. Now, Judge Gesmer's opinion and her dissent went in a certain sense even further, and I applaud her for doing that, because it's very clear that what she was saying is that where you have nonsense presented by an agency, a court can say it's nonsense. Here, just let me finish this one point. The issue of racial displacement was never studied by the city. If you look at Chapter 27 of the FEIS, with respect to repeated community calls for an understanding of what would happen to minority-owned businesses, minority-owned residences, you have the city saying, basically, we don't have to tell you. We don't know. They don't know. If you read their briefs below, as Judge Saunders said, they started giving analyses which aren't even in their secret. They're analyzing the issue in the briefs, but they didn't analyze them for the community in the FEIS. And counsel's explanation, frankly, is flimsy. The explanation is that we didn't see an impact. They didn't look for an impact. How can you claim that you didn't see an impact? On the commercial side, they certainly found there would be displacement of significant businesses. Are those the minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses? Isn't that something we should know? The fact is, they didn't do an analysis.
Counsel, this is Justice Moulton. Would you,
Sir.
do you agree with the city that only 200 units of housing were built in the preceding 2 decades before this EIS came out in this area?
Yes, I do, sir.
Okay, so taking that as a premise, their argument, contrary to what you're saying, is that by building so much more affordable housing, there won't be displacement. Meaning there won't be displacement of Dominican people or African-American people or anybody. So how do you respond to that?
I respond by saying they never did an SEIS which demonstrated it. The fact is, the affordable housing they're talking about, if you look carefully at it, is housing at an income level beyond that of all of the families you're talking about. That's the problem.
Did the city not show that one of your named plaintiffs, in fact, would qualify for some of the housing that's being offered?
One of them might qualify. There are 14 of them. So if you're telling me 13 wouldn't and 1 would, what is that demonstrating? It proves my point. They didn't do the analysis. See, we're not making substantive arguments right now that, as many of these cases do, and Judge Richter is saying, how do we distinguish this and that? These cases are saying there's a Section 8 violation here, there's a 1983 violation here. I'm a civil rights lawyer. I'm not making those arguments. I'm making threshold arguments. The arguments, if you don't look, how can you find? How can you make a critical analysis about institutional racism and whether it will be perpetuated or not by this if you won't look? They won't look. And what's the harm of looking? The judge annulled, but she said, I'm remanding it. I'm remanding it to you, city. Look at these factors, many of which really conjoin and deal with the same issue of whether there will be a significant racial ethnic change in this neighborhood by dint of this rezoning. That's the crucial issue. They can't make any substantive statements about it because they never looked. And this mantra of affordable housing, I've been an advocate in the Yonkers case for affordable housing. It's my case. I've been doing it since the 80s. But this is not the issue here because the use of the term affordable is deceptive in context. The rent levels in this community would be well transcended by the quote affordable units, the most affordable units in almost all what they're doing. But we don't have to get to that really because the issue is they never studied it. Tell me the effects on the minority community. Mr. Shaw can't tell me. The city can't tell you. The question is, should they be able to, in doing a massive rezoning of a neighborhood where approximately 85% of the people are people of color? And contrary to his argument about prior rezonings, which is fallacious, in other communities, in Williamsburg, in Park Slope, these were not zonings which were made for residential, for business purposes. They were made allegedly to support more affordable housing. And the displacement effects are profound, as this record shows.
Well, I think that was what I was referring to, a 2009 Supreme Court decision. It didn't go up above Supreme Court New York County, but also I think that was the Williamsburg and the Lower East Side, and that was sort of the issue I was asking about before. So that's what you're referring to, I think, Mr. Sussman.
Okay, Mr. Sussman, I'll let you answer Judge Kapnick, but then your time is up. Do you have anything further on that?
I do want to just make one brief comment. Thank you for your patience. And that is this. One of the things my clients were saying is that the city has repeatedly failed. And if you look at the record shows my clients proffer with regard to that in its analyses of these rezonings. Don't tell the community there'll be no displacing effect when each time you've said that, it's been incorrect.
But the council, this is Moulton again, from a public policy standpoint, I could understand your argument, but is that actually a requirement in the statute that they look at prior rezonings and see the effects and whether the effects comported with the predictions about what would happen under the rezonings? That's not included in secret as far as I can tell.
Thank you for the question. The statute and the Chinese staff case say explicitly, you must study population patterns. It says it very clearly.
But not go back and look at previous rezonings as you're advocating.
No, but they're related. Respectfully, they're related. Because if you're going to do a secret analysis and you're going to use the same secret manual, which has mispredicted each of these prior zonings, which is exactly what the showing made. If you read our client's submission, that's what they demonstrated. Then yes, you have to go back and demonstrate. He says there've been revisions, there'll be no revisions. There have been revisions because they've been dead wrong repeatedly on this critical issue, leading to segregation in the city. That's the ultimate issue here. We're trying to create one city with some degree of equitability and equity for people. That's what's not happening because they refuse to open their eyes and study it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Shore.
Thank you, Your Honor. With respect to the timing issue, Mr. Sussman and I apparently have a disagreement about the proper reading of 617.11a and c. As we noted in our reply brief, the state secret manual is consistent with our position on the timing issue.
Mr. Shore, could you answer what I would take as a broader policy argument that Mr. Sussman is making? Why isn't the racial impact both on commercial and residential relevant to this inquiry? Other than that, the courts that there's a prior case that may say you don't have to do that?
Well, Your Honor, the FEIS, the environmental review, is not the place where large issues of public policy are going to get resolved. I understand that Mr. Sussman feels very strongly about this rezoning. I know that his clients went to city council and tried to persuade them to vote no on the rezoning, but that political argument is really done and what should have been finished when city council approved the resolutions. The question here is whether applying the rule of reason, the city environmental review.
I'm sorry, Mr. Stewart, this is Justice Weber. I do not understand. Why is that a political consideration as to displacement of minorities in a particular area? I do not understand your comment that would be purely political.
I'm saying that many of Mr. Sussman's arguments go to politics and how the city ought to
But that
look
was
and how
not.
environmental review ought to be done.
I don't believe that was Justice Richter's question. The issue is the broader question in terms of whether or not there will be an impact on the minorities in that area. Mr. Sussman made an interesting point concerning about quote unquote affordable housing. How do we know what standard you're using in terms of affordability? So again, the question becomes, why would that not be something that should be considered in your environmental survey, your environmental determinations?
Well, Your Honor, this is a neighborhood, as Mr. Sussman points out, that is 75% Hispanic. And the finding that the city made that is not challenged in Mr. Sussman's petition is that there would be no substantial adverse effect on residential displacement for any of those people. So once that finding is made and unchallenged with respect to the neighborhood at large, which is what Chinese staff requires, then there doesn't seem, it can't be argued that it's irrational not to go further, delve deeper, and do the subgroup analysis. Someone can always come in and say, well, you should have looked at the data, you should have done a more granular analysis, you should have looked at it from a different perspective. But that is not how environmental review works. Environmental review gives a lot of discretion to the agency. Mr. Sussman said that, tried to distinguish one case by saying it's one project versus a neighborhood. I would note that Jackson involved a redevelopment of Times Square, a fairly significant neighborhood, and the subgroup analysis, as I mentioned, was not required. With respect to the affordability criteria, some of this affordable housing will be made available to people earning 30% of area media income, some to 40. A family of 3 at the 40% AMI level, it earns about $36,000 a year. And as Justice Moulton may have been indicating, the 175 units of permanently affordable housing in the new library project is almost as many new units as were created in this neighborhood over the last 20 years.
Okay, I think your time is up. Thank you very much, both counsel. Thank you for any other questions? Okay, thank you all. We'll look at this. People versus Shaquille White.